Okay, well, welcome everybody to those who have joined us today. It is 5 o'clock UK time, 12 o'clock in noon in the US on the East Coast. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first in our series of talks centered around our new exhibition, virtual exhibition at Benjamin Franklin House called Franklin in Portraits, where we look at some of Benjamin Franklin's most famous portraits. And today we have two guests here to speak more in detail about a certain portrait, which is the one by Robert Feke. And it is widely believed to be the earliest known portrait of Benjamin Franklin. And it's currently part of the Harvard Museum of Art collection, and it depicts Franklin as a traditional gentleman. Now, I have with me two very special guests. So we have Dr. George Boudreau, who is a cultural historian of early Anglo-American America, specializing in the history of Philadelphia, the work of Benjamin Franklin, material culture, and public history. And we also have Professor Zara Anishanslin, specializing in early American and Atlantic world history with a focus on 18th century material culture. So thank you both for joining us, and I'll let you both start the discussion.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Caitlin. I was delighted when the Franklin House staff asked if I would help organize this. I've been fascinated by Franklin's portraits since I first taught a course on Franklin at Indiana University in the early 90s. And I have to admit, I always laugh a bit about this because it was the one lecture I felt like I really didn't know what I was doing at the time. So I kept moving it back in the syllabus. So I would say, I think once a week, we'll do the Franklin portraits lecture later, and the kids would sort of groan, and then finally I started researching Franklin and portraits. But there's been such great work done on several of these items and their artists in recent years that when Caitlin and Eleanor asked me to help organize this, I said, well, rather than just hearing me nonstop, because I think the folks at the Franklin House have heard a lot from me, especially during lockdown. I should mention, I guess note for the historical record that for Philadelphians, this is day 364 of the new era. 1 year ago today was the last time I was allowed inside Independence Hall with a French film crew to film a documentary. So as of Saturday here, that will be a year in, I don't want to say prison, but you get it. But so I was delighted to do this and delighted that the Franklin House allowed us to invite other historians and art historians and curators of early Anglo-America, pardon me. And we had to kick off by the woman who has revolutionized I'm sorry, that was a bad slip, Feek studies. I remember meeting Zara Anishanslin when she was a doctoral candidate at the University of Delaware and being thrilled that she was working on Feek as an artist and what I consider to be Feek's masterpiece that has turned into, those of you in England should run down to Hatchard's right now and buy a copy of Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories in the British Atlantic World. For those of us as old as me, remember when we all had to read Fernand Braudel in graduate school? Zara proves once again that in a small object, or in this case, a very large piece of art, you can tell the whole history of a world. And it was fascinating to get to observe as she took this from dissertation study into now a Yale University Press book that I know I've seen it on bookshelves in London as well as in Philadelphia, of course. So I don't know if the Franklin House has it in their gift shop just yet, but since they're closed, you can call Hatchard's. I hope Hatchard's is still open. I don't know that for a fact. Zara is, as I said, a PhD from the University of Delaware. She has had, I think, pretty much every prize one can win as a cultural historian of this era, including fellowships at the Johns Hopkins University. And you're now at Princeton as a fellow. So
Yeah.
Zara, you're off from teaching for the moment to work on the next book.
Yes, I'm in Princeton, AKA my study in Philadelphia, as we all are in our home offices. But yes, working on my second book project, which has a lot to say about Benjamin Franklin in London, actually, and in Paris. So this is a really great chance for me to think about bridging the two projects.
So that one you'll be willing to do your book launch at Craven Street?
I mean, if you used my arm, sure, yes.
It's a wonderful site. I hope everybody who's on today has had the chance to visit Craven Street. We're hoping it'll be back open in May when London opens up. So maybe we'll get to that in a bit. And I believe now we're showing the first portrait. And this is a portrait of all of the Franklin portraits. It's the one I've gotten to spend the least amount of time with because, of course, it's up in New England at a school that Benjamin Franklin didn't get to attend. And it is, can I start off talking a little bit about the little I know about it? It's Franklin as a prosperous, middling sort master craftsperson of the middle of the 18th century. This is about the same time, and Zara can lock this in better than I can. This is about the time Franklin gave up active control of his printing business, which he did on the 1st of January in 1748. He took in a Scotsman named David Hall as his partner. Franklin put up all the material wealth and Hall did all the work, and they split the profits in a partnership for 18 years. This is Franklin really at the beginning of when he rises. I'm always nervous to say wealth, but he, according to Leo LeMay, the great late Franklin scholar, Franklin was making as much as a royal governor per year from his various investments and the printing houses he sponsored and that he took a cut on their profits on. So he is a guy who's on the rise here, but he obviously is not in the fanciest of clothes as someone with a real degree in art history can say a lot about who a person is being portrayed. But I always I've said to my students of this, there's no way anybody's setting type or running a printing press wearing these cuffs. And I remember you told me a long time ago about Feek portraits that cuffs and hands were very important, Zara. And I love the fact that he's wearing a periwig. Those of you in London can go over to Eden Ravencroft and fit yourselves for one of these. When I went shopping there once, they allowed me to sit in the judge's wigging room, which was a great honor, and they let me try on one of these. And for a guy without a lot of hair, it really does make you look much younger. I didn't buy one. I thought I probably couldn't pull it off in America. Couldn't get away with it. But Zara, would you tell us, how did you come to Robert Feke, and who is this guy, and why is he important?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about this portrait first and why it's not quite as straightforward as it seems, maybe, which makes for, I hope, an interesting discussion. And I took a quick look at the participants and noticed there are a number of my favorite art historians in the crowd today. So since I'm a historian rather than an art historian, although I play one sometimes in the classroom, I'm hoping that that this can very much turn into a conversation after ours, George, because this portrait on its surface has been talked about as being the earliest, as you say, the earliest known representation of Benjamin Franklin, painted circa 1746 to 50. So around the time that Franklin was making his transition, so to speak. I think of it as sort of like emerging from the cocoon of his printer years and using that wealth to transform into the butterfly of natural philosopher that he became. So this is him right on the cusp of, in terms of chronology, becoming Franklin the international cause célèbre, and he's still, though, transitioning into someone who becomes much more influential in colonial Pennsylvania than he had been previously in terms of his influence on government. Particularly in the aftermath of King George's War, which ended in 1748. He was instrumental in some political maneuverings around that time, shall we say. So this portrait then is painted at a moment that very much is celebrating, I think, a transitional period in Franklin's life that's very important and pivotal to understanding his future role in London, right? And his future role internationally speaking. And as you say, George, he's represented very much as a typical gentleman of his time. Feek also painted some men with very flashy, metallic, glittery embroidered waistcoats. This is not that type of portrait. This is very typical of Feek's more soberly clad gentlemen of the same time period. And so this very much fits into Franklin himself at that time period in terms of what he probably would have wanted to project as his image, and also Feek's style of the 1746 to 50 time period. And he did make 2 visits to Philadelphia in that time, one in 1746, one in 1750. And in 1748, he was mostly active in Boston and Newport. And this portrait is interesting because it has a very clear documentary provenance, which is not always the case with colonial portraits. It descended, it was mentioned in the will of John Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's brother, who was a soap and candle maker living in Newport, Rhode Island, who bequeathed it in his will to his beloved wife. And it descended then in their family until the 1840s. So it's got a very clear provenance of attachment, of being noted in a family will, then descending in the family. But what's intriguing about this is, as delightful as that archival documentation is, the object itself sort of belies the idea that this is a very straightforward Feek painting. And that is because as people have been sort of wrestling with this since the 19th, but especially in the early 20th century, this was first come to popular consumption in 1840 when Jared Sparks published the works of Benjamin Franklin. So like a lot of 18th century objects, we have the 19th century to thank for muddying our view of the object between the 18th century and today. And it was sort of accepted very straightforwardly as the earliest known representation of Franklin by Robert Feke, because it's very typical in many respects, in the clothing, in the background, in the pose of the work of Feek of the time. It also had, as I mentioned, this very clear family provenance, this archival documentation. But art historians were worried, troubled, shall we say, by something going on with the face, which I'll get into in a moment and talk about the X-ray history of this piece. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about why I think that in the long run, as a historian, I'm much less troubled by whether someone else painted over the face or painted the face than I am by the historical possibilities of thinking about the connections of Robert Feke and Benjamin Franklin. So Caitlin, if you could go to the next slide, which shows the painter himself in his early self-portrait. Here you see him very much styling himself as a gentleman in his typical gentlemanly pose. This is Robert Feke, or as I like to call him, my 18th century boyfriend. And look at that visage, I think you know exactly why. And speaking of his visage, there's tantalizingly little documentary evidence about Robert Feke, but one of the great pieces of documentation about him is Alexander Hamilton, not of the musical fame, but the itinerant Scottish physician who predated him, who left a record of meeting him in Newport, Rhode Island, and said he had exactly the phiz of a painter, with these soulful dark eyes that stared at you, and commented on how he was, and I quote, had the force of natural genius, that he had done tolerably well by the force of genius because he'd never been trained by anyone other than himself. And he saw a copy that he made of a frontispiece of the Earl of Shaftesbury's Characteristics, The Judgment of Hercules, a print that he transformed into a history painting that he thought was very impressive. So Robert Feke and Benjamin Franklin are similar in a lot of ways. They are born within a year or so of one another, so they're contemporaries. They're both men who sort of create themselves. Robert Feke is born in Oyster Bay, Long Island, actually from a much better pedigreed family than Benjamin Franklin. His great-grandfather was also named Robert Feke. They all have the same name. It's makes for hard research. His great-grandfather, Robert Feke, came over in the vanguard of John Winthrop's movement to Plymouth, Massachusetts. And when Henry Winthrop, John Winthrop's somewhat wayward son, died in a drowning accident, his widow, Elizabeth, married Robert Feke, the great-grandfather of the painter. And so you have this multi-generational connection between some of the great founding families in Puritan Massachusetts, and the Fekes, who by a combination of personal scandal, religious dissension, and I think economic reasons as well, moved to Oyster Bay, Long Island, later in the 17th century, which is where Robert Feke is born, the son of a blacksmith who is also someone who is tasked with making sure oysters don't get stolen from Oyster Bay and shipped outside of the town without their knowledge, and also is interestingly a Quaker who converts into a Baptist minister and is actually ordained in Newport, Rhode Island. And so the Fekes are a really fascinating family, not least because within a few generations, you see Puritans, Quakers, and Baptists, right? And so how Robert Feke gets his training, we don't know, but he is largely, if not entirely, self-taught. He certainly copied other colonial artists and British artists who came to the colonies. And you can see, if you go to the next slide, I think, how quickly his work develops. This is his first, this is the portrait that sort of jettisons him into the colonial big time, which is nothing like the London big time, which is another topic entirely. But in 1741, he painted this group portrait of Isaac Royal, who you see there on the right, and his family, which is his wife and their sisters, as well as their young child. And this is modeled very closely after an earlier work by John Smibert of Bishop George Berkeley, future bishop, not bishop yet, George Berkeley and his entourage to celebrate the moment that they are coming to Newport, Rhode Island, en route to establish what he hoped would be a grandiose college in Bermuda, which never came to fruition. But so in 1741, this is Feek. And then if we could go to the next slide, you'll see around, not quite this, a little bit after the 1741 portrait, a portrait of one of the children of Gershom Flagg on the left. This is a girl holding a peach. And this is a delightful portrait, but I think you can agree that it is far less sophisticated than the 1748 portrait of Isaac Winslow on the right, which is commissioned to celebrate the victory at Louisbourg over the French. So what you see here in a very short span of time, less than a decade, is Feek's massive improvement through practice, essentially, as a portrait painter. And then if we go to the next slide, we can look into how he was painting around 1748 when the Franklin portrait would have been done around that same time period. And here you see three members of the Apthorpe family of Boston who commissioned these portraits to likely hang in a specific room in their home. And I say that because the middle portrait of their daughter, Grisel Apthorpe, is square. It's one of the few square portraits that Feek painted, and it was probably commissioned to hang within a square space in their Boston home. Grisel the Mother, I told you all these people in the 18th century have the same name. Grisel the Mother, you see, is posed there on the left, and she is reading an open book of John Milton's Paradise Lost, open to the page that describes the fall. Her daughter, Grisel Apthorpe, who for Londoners you'll be interested to know, goes on to become Mrs. Barlow Trecothick, so the future MP and Lord Mayor of London. She's sitting there posed with an open book of music, and it's the musical score to John Milton's Comus. And then on the right is the father, Charles Apthorpe, one of the wealthiest merchants in Boston, posed with a ship in the distance and letters in front of him, and the head of one of the islands in Boston Harbor that he owns in the background. So if you look at these portraits, you can see, and we'll get back to the cuff, right? I'll focus on the cuff, as George said, very much typical of Feek and his wonderful treatment of textiles. Something I want you to notice, though, is the similarity of the clothing in terms of its sobriety, so to speak, and yet obviously this would have represented great wealth. This type of fabric would have been imported, would have been expensive. The Charles Apthorpe is wearing, he also is wearing a wig. And then if you look at the women, a lot of you will have already picked up on the fact that they're wearing the exact same dress, but in different colors. And in fact, they have the same figure. And that's not just because they're mother and daughter. It's because Feek often painted this exact same womanly figure over and over again, this exact same dress in Philadelphia and Boston and Newport, but in different colors. So the point of this is, and this is important to our story about the portrait of Benjamin Franklin, Feek often used these sort of stock figures from print sources that he copied the poses, and then he changed them up to personalize them with the insertion, for example, of Milton for mother and daughter in this case, in book and music, and or Americanize them, which he does a lot of the time. So he's not just flat out emulating British print sources, as he does in Charles Apthorpe's portrait with the island that he owned in Boston Harbor behind him. And so it would not at all be strange if the body in the Benjamin Franklin portrait was in fact very much a body that was modeled after either a body that Feek found in a mezzotint print source and or a body that he replicated over and over again in his portraiture that he painted of men at the time. So if we could go on to the next slide. I wanted to show you the Feek portrait of Benjamin Franklin in conversation with two other portraits that he painted in 1748. The one of Charles Apthorp that I've talked now a little bit about, and then in the middle, a portrait that is representative of the more flashy style that you sometimes see with men of the time period. And this is James Boudreau, if I'm remembering correctly. But if you look at the cuffs of the Franklin piece, and if you look at the body, if you look at the pose, you look at the coat, you can see the similarities, right? You're already training to be Feek scholars. You can tell that the body, the pose, etc., are very typical of Feek. The background is typical of Feek. So everything about this, and in fact, the background is noticeably similar between Apthorp's and Franklin's, although Franklin, not being a merchant who owns an island, is not painted in front of a harbor with his island behind him. But you're starting to get the picture, right? So let's talk a little bit, though, about why this portrait has been problematized, because if you look at it, you're like, yeah, it's clearly a Feek. But much more linear. It's much more typical of, for example, when painters would just copy directly from a print and not be painting from life. That's easier to do with a body than a face, right? And so it has been suggested by art historians, as I mentioned, for years, that this is not a face done by Franklin. So if it's not by Feek, rather. So if it's not a face done by Feek, what does that mean? First of all, I'd like to suggest I'm not even sure that really matters, because every portrait in colonial America is a negotiated interpretation of a person, not a straightforward depiction of reality. And I think that makes portraits much more interesting in colonial America than just thinking of them as a direct representation of someone's likeness. But I also think that it's intriguing to think about the afterlife that colonial portraits have, and about how and why someone would perhaps superimpose Franklin's face on a Feek portrait, which any way you look at it is a nod to Feek's skills, right? That you want to memorialize this. So if we can move on to the next portrait, I want to talk a little bit now about Feek and Franklin, and what specifically is the beef with the face here in terms of Franklin's face. So in the early 20th century, an art historian called Alan Burroughs was troubled by the linearity of this face as being not very Feek-like, and did some very early X-rays of this portrait. And basically, he went back and forth. He thought at first that it might be the work of John Greenwood superimposed on Feek, and then he came down again thinking it might be Feek. Much more recently, in 2013, David Pullins published a piece in the Burlington magazine based on new X-rays, 21st century X-rays, in which he argues that based on the application of the paint in Feek's in the Feek portrait of Franklin, that the body, the background, etc., are by Feek, but the hands and the face have been either completely done over or retouched by a contemporary artist, so contemporary to Feek. So this is not some later 19th century botched job. This is definitely an 18th century, in terms of the pigment, 18th century application. But Pullins argues, because of the thick mechanical application of the paint on the face and the hands, that it is someone who came in and overlaid Franklin's face, either based on real life, but probably much more likely a miniature or a print based on the Wilson portrait of Franklin from the early 1760s. So sort of adding on to a pre-existing Feek figure. Now, this is possible chronologically because John Franklin, who owned the painting initially, if it's the same painting referenced in his will, died in 1756. Feek probably died in 1752. He certainly disappears and is painting no more. And so if this painting is present in the hands of John Franklin, there are a couple of possibilities for retouching this. And the one that is put forward popularly by Burroughs, among others, is John Greenwood. And if you go to the next slide, I think that will take us to Greenwood, who is a fascinating painter. no one holds candle to my 18th century boyfriend, but he's absolutely fascinating in terms of his life, not least because he's born in New England and ends up in Suriname and then Amsterdam and then London. So he's one of these fascinating itinerant characters of the 18th century Atlantic world. You see on the left a portrait that he painted in 1751, which if he did touch up the face of Franklin or add the face of Franklin to a Feek body, this would have been the year he did it, because Feek sailed for Bermuda or Barbados around sometime in 1751, died in 1751 or 52, and in 1752, Greenwood left for Suriname. So the portrait on the left, top left, is a portrait that's in the collections of Historic New England that was done by Greenwood in 1751. So the same time period that some art historians have conjectured that he might have painted Feek's face. He certainly was there. He could have done it. Did he do it though? If you look at the portrait, who I think is Mrs. Richard Waldron, if I'm remembering correctly. And if you look at Greenwood's a detail from his famous sea captains carousing in Suriname, picturing Rhode Island merchants at their debauched best, gathered around the table, carousing together. This doesn't scream Greenwood to me, this face of Feek, by any stretch. But we do have a portrait that is likely of John Franklin's wife, attributed to Greenwood. So you're starting to get a picture, right, of how complicated these colonial American portraits and their stories can be. But if we move to the next slide, what I'd like to suggest is that this is actually, as I said, I'm less concerned with whether or not this is 100% by Feek, face and body, as the fact that it's certainly, if not for the face, that the body is definitely by Feek. The background is definitely by Feek. And I should have mentioned Feek's typical brushwork is very light and airy. So it's very much at odds with this sort of thick, mechanical sort of linearity of the face that shows up in the X-ray application. But if you look at a portrait that we know is entirely by Robert Feke, one of the few portraits he signed, of the 60 or so that are attributed to him, he only signed about 11. And this is a portrait of Anne Shippen Willing, Philadelphia matron. And you can see here that Feek did not use his wasp-waisted, print-sourced portrait type that he used for the Apthorpe ladies. This is Mrs. Willing in all her busty glory. And this is an actual identifiable dress. This is sort of core of my book that George mentioned, Portrait of a Woman in Silk. A dress of Spitalfield silk, designed by Anna Maria Garthwaite in Spitalfields in 1743, woven by French Huguenot weaver Simon Gilens that same year. And somehow between then and 1746 made its way across America to Philadelphia to become the dress that Anne Shippen Willing, who's the wife of a very wealthy merchant mayor, wears in her portrait here. Now, what I show you next to her is a copycat portrait done of the Feek portrait of Anne Shippen Willing. And lots of colonial artists copied Feek's, right? If you're in the colonies and you can't go to St. Martin's Lane's Academy, right, to learn from other painters and drawers, who do you learn from? You learn from the portraits that are hanging on the walls of homes and courthouses and other places. And so what you see on the right is a copycat portrait of Feek, his portrait of Anne Shippen Willing, but one in which those of you who have an eye for such things will notice the folds drape differently, right? So this is a portrait in which she's actually wearing this identifiably real dress of her sister-in-law, because this is Mary Shippen, the wife of Anne Shippen Willing's husband, Edward. And you'll see that that she's borrowed the pose of the Feek portrait, right? And the dress itself. So the painter who's making this, who is not my 18th century boyfriend, he's much more skilled than this, is clearly looking though at the Feek portrait while also painting the woman from life. And so what I think this Franklin portrait does is show you how fluid and flexible and adaptable colonial American artists have to be in this time period, whether it's reusing canvases, whether it's superimposing faces, whether it's learning from studying other colonial artists. You can see a lot of really interesting things at play here. And I think also that you see this is sort of, if you think about the Feek portrait of the young girl, the flag girl, holding her peach, and you think about how far he's come in terms of his skill by the time he gets to the portrait on the left. If you think about the portrait on the right, which might be by John Hyselius, perhaps, we're not sure who it's by. This is in the Newark, New Jersey Museum's collection. But it's clearly not by Feek, right? But it's another colonial painter who's trying to find himself, who's trying to find his way into painting portraits, as I mentioned, without being able to go to St. Martin's Lane, right? Without being able to go look at larger collections of paintings for the most part. So if we move to the next portrait, I just wanted to get back to the sort of typical Feeks, right? That Feek not only is copied by other painters, he copies himself. And I think this is pretty evident in these three women, two of whom on the left, as I mentioned, are the Apthorpes, who are related to one another. And then on the right, you see a Newport, Rhode Island woman who's not related to them, but clearly it's the same body being copied, right? The same arms, the same hands, in different colors from various print sources. So I think what I'd like to do here is pause, George, and ask what questions you have, or what points that you'd like to have me follow up on. And the one thing I'll say before we do that is that there are a number of intriguing personal connections between Franklin and Feek. That do, I think, make it likely that Franklin would have wanted to sit for his portrait to Feek, not just because it was a perfect time in his life to do so, but also because Franklin had by this period of time founded the library company. He had founded one of the parent organizations that would become the American Philosophical Society. They had a lot of contacts in common through the library company, through the men who were involved in this sort of interconnected literary and scientific community in America. Feek, in his trip to Philadelphia in 1746, painted a number of the early members of the library company, including Charles and Anne Willing, who were certainly known to Benjamin Franklin. Charles Willing, the Willings not only were early members of the library company, they frequented Franklin's businesses, and their daughters, Sally Bache and Anne Willing Francis, were friends and co-leaders of a patriotic endeavor during the American Revolution. And also, I think too that one of the ways that Feek honed his painterly skills was through books. He goes on to paint a number of the founding members of the Redwood Library, which is similar in intent to the Library Company of Philadelphia. And he certainly had access to books through that. And one of his paintings that stayed in his personal collection and is likely modeled, the person itself is modeled after his wife, Eleanor, is a representation of Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. So a representation of Pamela from Richardson's novel, painted around the time the novel came out. And Benjamin Franklin himself put out an edition of Pamela in 1742, around a year or so after we think Feek painted this portrait of Pamela. So if you stop and think about the worlds in which Franklin and Feek are living, right? They're not just contemporaries. They overlap in really intriguing ways. They are both men who sort of use their natural genius, right? This nascent American natural genius to push themselves into careers and into social spheres and into personal connections that would not have been theirs by birth alone. And so this is one reason why I say, to me, I think that the chance to connect the two men is such a much more fascinating historical thing than whether or not Franklin's face is 100% by Feek or not. But a fascinating chance to think about, in this case, how art historians have identified that the object itself might be somewhat at odds with the historical documentation that historians so love. So George, thoughts? Where do you want to go from here?
Thank you. And I have to apologize, Zara. Your old friend, my Vishla, whose name is Maggie, has been enjoying this a great deal. So I keep muting myself because Maggie's talking to you in the background. So if you hear a loud mewing noise, I swear it's not me. That was really fascinating. And I really love the work you've done with this. I guess I'd start by piggybacking on, I just 2 days ago gave a lecture on Franklin as sort of the rising civic organizer for our course at Penn. I think the two major things that he's done right before the dates of this portrait are he creates the Union Fire Company. So oddly, Philadelphia had no system of firefighting. It was very much, if somebody yells fire, you grab your scrub bucket and run into the street, but there was no organization. And he addressed that after a major fire that burned down a number of buildings. If you're a Philadelphian and on this, near the intersection of Front and Walnut Streets, and creates this. And it's amazing in the documents about him, the way this slams him into people's public consciousness. And then a decade later, Franklin was the one who created the Associators. And I think we're often, I'm one of those historians who can teach the history of the 18th century and never do a lecture about a war. But at the beginning of the conflicts going on in the 1740s, for the first time, Pennsylvania is attacked by a foreign power. Two plantations in what we then called the three lower counties. Today, President Biden insists we call it the state of Delaware. Two were attacked by privateers under the employ of France. And Franklin used the method he uses over and over again to step out of the personal into the persona of we are a group of public-minded individuals. There was no group at this point. It was Ben Franklin. Creates the Associators, and when they offer him a military or an officer's post, he refuses it. He almost never refuses elected office. But he says, I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't lead troops. They find a man who has English military experience instead. But that moment just cements him into a leadership position. And as my old mentor at Manchester College said, that's not a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But the people of Philadelphia, the majority of the people of Philadelphia are enamored of what he's done. He's the guy who's keeping their houses from burning down. 1752, he founded the Philadelphia Contribution Ship and then refused to stay on making money from the endeavor. He left the board after 2 years. But he's the guy who's helping save the town from fire, which is probably the biggest threat that really exists to most people's wealth and daily lives. And then he's the guy who actually steps in, and unlike the members of the Society of Friends who are still running the assembly, or certainly the Penn family, who become Franklin's great enemies. For those of you who don't do a lot of Pennsylvania history, Pennsylvania was always a proprietary colony, meaning it was founded by a guy whose name was William Penn. Probably most of us have heard of him, as a haven for religious dissenters. But Quakers don't believe in war. And the Friends had refused to raise money to pay for warfare, and the Penns didn't really like paying their bills. William Penn's sons, John, Thomas, Richard, and I'm probably leaving one out, thought of Pennsylvania as dad's investment that should be paying us an annual dividend. They never wanted to pay land taxes, and they became very disgusted by Benjamin Franklin. And there are a series, Zara, I think a word I always remember using, there's a series of snarky letters between Thomas Penn, who was the chief proprietor by this point, and the Reverend Mr. Richard Peters, in which Peters, in one of them says, the call for the Associators, it's organized by Franklin, who's the organizer of everything, the library company, the fire company, and now this. And they're not saying this is a compliment. And for those of us who've read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, Zara, I don't know if you were on that, but we did Ben's book club during the pandemic where we led a reading group on it. And mine, I don't, it's right under your book on my desk. So this is my Leo LeMay edition of Franklin's writings. But Franklin writes himself into a corner when he finally writes about this in the 1780s. He gets himself to London. Unfortunately, he never gives us a brief or an extended description of how the house was decorated at Craven Street, et cetera. But he gets himself to London and he can't write himself out. And as I never really thought of until the Huntingdon Library, let me use the original manuscript for an afternoon. I think we were at Long Beach together, or Pasadena together that year, weren't we, both doing research. There's no period at the end of the autobiography, which I'm very happy to say LeMay, this is someone asked me to cite this. This is J. Leo LeMay's Benjamin Franklin's Writing from the Library of America series. Still available, still in print. There's a 1-volume and 2-volume edition. But Franklin writes himself into a corner that he never wrote himself out of. He couldn't get this. So this idea that you're presenting him as a part of this trans-colonial elite of these various societies, because the colonies were vastly different in many ways, is fascinating. I am not an art historian, so I've never gotten into the brushstrokes of the Feek portrait. Are there images of the X-ray, or is that possible to do? Or
Not that I've seen. I think you'd have to talk to Harvard about that.
And they probably won't let you show up with an X-ray device to start scanning their paintings.
No, probably not. But it's not, as you know, it's not unusual for people to go back and forth about which painters did colonial portraits, and even signed ones, right? There's some back and forth about a lot of these things. So this is what's intriguing about this is it's rare to have, as I say, a portrait that is linked to such clear archival documentation and family provenance, and is clearly at least partly by Feek, right? If not entirely. And to have this sort of hybrid situation going on, I think is a really fascinating chance to think about the broader history of colonial American portraiture, as well as what this would have represented in terms of Franklin's life at the time.
And a portrait is a really rare thing. I recently had a non-historian say to me, almost looking for the conspiracy theory of it, well, why were there no portrait of Franklin painted in his youth? And I said, well, how many baby portraits do we, the one of Feek's that you showed us today, I'd never seen before. I mean, they're scarce as hen's teeth.
Yeah. It's in a private collection.
Wow. It's phenomenal. You've shared it with us today.
Where it's well cared for. The owner calls them his 18th century grandchildren by Feek. So, but yeah, I mean, I think although it's interesting, one of the and Carrie Detour, and I see your question. I will actually email you those so you have them. But the issue has been raised of whether Franklin could have afforded a portrait by Feek in this time period. And George, as you mentioned, certainly by 1748, he's earning enough money. He's also starting to commission furniture and silver. And, anyone who's read Franklin's autobiography knows that there's a lot of "the lady doth protest too much" in his speaking of, being abstemious and frugal. And yeah, he was okay with ordering some of the finer things.
Water American who didn't want to help pay everybody else's bar bill.
Yes, even though he acts as though it's Deborah who is driving this consumption. It's not, as we know from his letters back and forth once he goes to London in particular. But it's important to point out that although portraits, as you say, are rare and are definitely elite things, portraits of this size, I should say, this is a half portrait. So this is large. This is not a miniature. This is not something you can hold in your hand. It's something to hang on the wall. But they're not that expensive in the scheme of household furnishings, which they would have been considered as being part of much more than being what we think of as art today, right? And in fact, we know this because Feek himself, we have records for 2 sets of painting commissions that he did in Newport, one in which he painted a figure of the same size, of the same type of pose as the Franklin portrait, and he got around 31 pounds for it. On the other hand, if you got a super fancy gilded bespoke frame, that was going to add a great deal to the value of your portrait. And Feek also painted a portrait of a Newport man and his wife, the Bannisters, very wealthy mercantile family, that included gilded frames. And we know this because the original frames still survive on them today, and they're fabulous, they're matching. And for that, he was paid 200 pounds, but that was because of the frames, not because of the portrait itself. And so this is a time period in which, for example, if the Franklins are ordering new textiles to drape their bed in curtains, they would assuredly pay more on those textiles than they would pay for this portrait. So I think it's important to put that into perspective, that yes, portraits are an elite thing to have, but they're also not if you think of them as household furnishings, which colonial people did, as in fact the banisters in the accounts for the year in which he's listing giving Feek these 200 pounds for the framed portraits, listed under his expenses for household furnishings, not as a separate portrait or art category. So I think it's important to remember that these are seen as part of the house, right?
Yeah.
Much more than a sort of an artistic thing as we think of portraits today.
Maybe to throw a little context into it, students are always asking me, well, what is that in real money? And for a point of reference, when Franklin came back to America after the first 1720s trip and printing in London, he came back as a merchant's clerk making 50 pounds a year. So that's a pretty good endeavor for Feek. If Feek's getting paid 61 pounds for a portrait or 200 pounds for two, that's good income. One of the things that my time as a temporary fellow at Winterthur made me look at, and you're much more an expert on this than I am, is the challenges of what it takes to create a portrait. There is no art shop down at the corner. I'm always fascinated, and I look at our participant list, and we have a who's who of curators from around the Atlantic world, as I guess we can still call it today, looking at you and your beautiful study, and me and my very messy one. But how often these paintings were done on, there's a favorite of mine at Winterthur that was done on a damask tablecloth. The sort of preposterous nature of, has anyone seen the dining room tablecloth? Oh yeah, well, we painted grandma on it instead. So, and I know at one point the Franklins were selling art supplies, painter supplies, in the shop, in Deborah's own handwriting in the 1730s. We have her selling paint stuff to itinerant painters.
Yeah, which is important because sometimes people can't get the paint supplies they need. There's a woman, Henrietta Johnston, who's painting in South Carolina, and you can see very visibly when she could and could not get access to the watercolors that she needed to paint her miniatures. There's a marked qualitative difference, right? Because as you say, you don't have good paint supplies on every corner, which is why often canvases are reused. One of the reasons they're often reused and painted over. And Kate had a question in the comments about could Feek have originally painted Franklin's Newport brother, and the brother's family had the face overpainted once they procured the print of Franklin. That is definitely a possibility because one of the things that would have happened when, and we don't know the details of this, but when Feek disappeared and then died, no one else in his family, he didn't have a child who went on to become a painter. And so what they likely did was disperse the studio, except for the paintings that they kept in the family, such as an unfinished pair companion portraits of Feek and his wife, a later self-portrait, which is overpainted in the 19th century with not pretty results. But so there were some paintings they kept in the Feek family, but his children went on to become an apothecary, a sea captain. His daughter Phila married John Townsend, the famous furniture cabinet maker in Newport. And so no one went on, though, to become a painter. And so what likely happened was that the finished and half-finished canvases in his studio that weren't accounted for, that weren't paid for, got dispersed if people wanted them, right? So this is a possibility, too, that because Franklin's brother and sister-in-law were in Newport, they could have gotten a Feek portrait typical of the time period, right? It's very clear to me this is typical of Feek in the 1746 to 50 time period, right? And they could have added the face once they had either a miniature or a print to work from, both of which they had by 1761, certainly. Although this is where the documentation comes in, because Franklin's brother John dies in 1756. So it would have had to, if anything, if it's the portrait referenced in John Franklin's will, and it's highly unlikely that they would have had in this same family, particularly after the brother dies in 1756, multiple portraits of Benjamin Franklin, right? That to me seems unlikely. Then I think this would have been something that, if the face is painted not from life, would have been done from, perhaps Franklin did give a miniature to his sister Jane Meekham in the 1750s. So it could have been something based on the miniature, which again might explain its linearity and its lack of sophistication, because converting a miniature to a bigger portrait is going to make unless you're very skilled, is going to need some changes.
There's no I should have gone into the Franklin account books, which are now being digitized at APS, but there's no mention of, he doesn't say, I had to sit for Feek today, and there's no reference to that.
No, but very few people do talk about that. Of the many portraits that Feek painted of Philadelphians, for example, in 1746 and 1750, there's only one mention in one diary of Feek's presence in Philadelphia in both of those visits. So, it's not unusual. Yeah.
He didn't advertise. It wasn't one of these people trading space in the Pennsylvania Gazette for.
He didn't have to. They all wanted him to paint them when he came into town. Yeah.
It must have been, and then there was no real practicing Philadelphia portraitist at this time. Boston and New England had been, and I guess we could blame that on Quaker hesitancy among the wealthiest. Although there's an old trope that says Quakers didn't believe in portraiture; they thought it was a vanity. And I said that once to the librarian at Haverford College, a Quaker school just west of where Zara and I are now. And the librarian said, look around the room, and the entire room is lined in portraits of 18th century Quakers. So somebody was getting painted.
Yes. And Gustavo Cecilia had a long and successful career in Philadelphia before Feek came into town. So it's not as though there had never been colonial painters in Philadelphia. But yes, so I think it's a good reminder, though, that we can even talk about that we only have a handful of options when we talk about if someone else did paint the face, who it was, right? I think is very revealing of the state of known artists practicing as limners, as portrait painters in colonial America.
And we can say definitively that the family by the 19th century is saying this is a portrait of Benjamin Franklin. I mean, this is how it got to Harvard. I mean, Harvard wouldn't have wanted a picture of John Franklin.
Well, and it clearly is Benjamin Franklin. If you look at, it's a good representation of Franklin. I don't think that's in doubt. It's just, did Feek paint that face, or did someone else paint that face? But Feek, it's certainly a Feek portrait in the majority of its composition, the body, the pose, the background. So it's just a question of, is that wig, is that wig Feek's, and is that face Feek's? And if someone painted it, did they overlay a bit on the other hand that's sticking out so the pigments matched? But it's also not uncommon, for example, for people to ask to have their portraits changed themselves, to update them. There are a number of examples of this where women choose to have sort of lacy caps painted in that then go out of fashion, and they have them painted out. There's a really famous example that I'm sure most, if not everyone in the audience, is familiar with, a Copley painting in which a woman is wearing, a patterned silk dress, and then Jemima Winslow. And then when she goes to London as part of the Loyalist diaspora in the Revolutionary era, has that by now outmoded patterned silk painted over as a plain fabric, right? So this is not uncommon too. You sort of, much like we retouch our selfies today. This is, you can get your painting updated by another artist's hand later. So this is also a possibility because the tests on the pigments reveal that they are 18th century, but how many years in the 18th century is another question.
As enough of an old antiques collector, I'm always stunned at the idea that someone would touch up a painting, which my late grandmother was very fond of doing. If she, didn't like the face in one of her, she was not buying Feek's, but she would occasionally get out a paintbrush and add a smile to somebody. And one of the most appalling examples of that is, 19th century people who decided, the painting's in bad shape, so we need to clean it or need to touch it up. And I think one of the saddest examples of that is a very young Benjamin West, who is going to be a subject of an upcoming program, painted the Reverend Mr. William Smith, who was the provost of the College of Philadelphia and one of Franklin's great discoveries, and became one of his bitterest enemies. But West did one of his juvenile portraits of Smith that one of the Smith granddaughters decided to clean up in the 19th century, and it's now in the Atwater Kent collection in storage here in Philadelphia. But the touch-up is just appalling. I mean, it looks like somebody went to, attacked it with a paint-by-numbers set, which is made literally what she'd done. It just, it takes him out of focus. But we have a few more minutes, and I know we've had a few questions. Would anyone like, we can't see you. This isn't one of those Zooms, so you all have to email me or write me on Facebook after this, or call Zara, or we have a couple. Have we? Megan is the most recent one that just popped up. Can you address this?
Yeah. So, and then Michael Hartman had a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Right before Megan said, also asked about the landscape background and whether this is related to portraiture convention, or whether it links to, as Michael queried, Franklin's aspirations to be a large landowner, perhaps, or related to Megan's, whether it's a continuity with the posthumous portrait of his son, Francis, who, as everyone here knows, I'm sure, sadly died because he was not inoculated against smallpox, right?
Get your jab, everyone, get your jab.
Yes, exactly, an early cautionary tale about not being an anti-vaxxer. So yes, so I do think these are great questions. One of the things that is true of Feek's portraits, certainly, is that he has a real habit, replicated Newport, Boston, Philadelphia, of taking, when he copies a pose from a mezzotint source, from a print source, he almost always completely changes the background. And almost invariably, he changes an interior for an exterior. And in certain cases, as I pointed out with Charles Apthorpe, there is an identifiable American landscape element there. And so this is interesting because this makes the argument that Americans are not incorporating localized landscapes until much later. This is much earlier, obviously. So this is pre-Revolutionary War, right? Pre even twinkle of an eye in terms of thinking of the revolution. And so Feek, though, does have this habit of using localized landscapes, of placing his American subjects, even if they're modeled after British mezzotints, in these often localized scenes, with identifiable islands in Boston Harbor, in Rhode Island, for example. And so I think that there is something going on there, Megan and Michael, absolutely. Now, I don't know, I've never seen anything that indicates that Franklin had landowner aspirations. Have you, George?
He got very into the idea of Western colonization. And during his time, particularly the time that the house on Craven Street interprets, he is trying to figure out a way to create a land company to create a Western colony in what we would probably think of as Ohio and Kentucky. And the government doesn't want any part of it. You know, they have just gotten out of a series of wars on the Western frontier. It's going to take troops. George III's government is broke, and he can't get the colonists to pay pay anything towards defense. I don't think Franklin ever saw himself as a plantation owner. He didn't want to necessarily go there, but he saw this as a great idea. And you know, from the 1750s on, he's saying America's going to outstrip England. We're going to have more English people here than you have there. And,
lots of babies.
Sorry.
Lots of American babies.
Yes, you know, our colonists were marrying younger, reproducing more. They were burning through land. Franklin had a complicated history with Native Americans who actually owned that land and were living on it. Mm-hmm. But as some of you who are social media friends know, I discovered last year through one of my Canadian cousins that one of my ancestors in Central Virginia was tomahawked and his son dragged off to what we now call Michigan at the start of what we call the 7 Years' War. So this is a problem that touched people's lives. They were thinking about what Western expansion could mean. And remember, the Lord Proprietor, wasn't a Lord, Thomas Penn, the head proprietor, had no interest at all in settlers moving west. He wanted them crowded around Philadelphia, paying his quit rents. He saw this as a disastrous idea. And the Penn family often had more political sway at Whitehall than the Franklin or the other colonial agents did. I'm always trying to drag a little bit of American history onto Craven Street. And I know I'm conscious we're running out of time. Z, do you have any final comments before we say goodbye?
No, I think I would just like to emphasize that, I think that whether or not this is 100% Franklin by Feek done, circa 1748, I think it certainly is, it still bears being celebrated as the earliest known representation of Franklin, because whether that representation was overlaid 5 years after the fact, I think doesn't change the idea that this very much represents Franklin at this moment in time. Franklin as someone who has made his mark in colonial America and will soon become, a quite different level of making his mark. But this is also intriguing because this captures Franklin at a moment before, as he famously says, his face becomes as well known as that of the moon, right? So I love dwelling upon this portrait, even with all its complexities and uncertainties, because it is identifiably the work of colonial artists and identifiably capturing Franklin at this colonial moment in time where he is poised to enter the big time of London and beyond.
Thank you. And I'll say again, as an unpaid commercial plug, those of you on either side of the Atlantic today, get a copy of Portrait of a Woman in Silk by Zara Anishanslin, published through Yale University Press. I've seen it on bookshelves in the UK. And I'd also like to invite you, I don't know if we have the definitive schedule, but this is the first of a series. I'll be chiming in questions and babbling on a bit about Franklin's biography with some wonderful material culture specialists and art historians and curators, a group of wonderful scholars that the women of the Franklin House have pulled together. So make sure you check out the Franklin House website and get on their emailing list. And as ever, the old development director in me would say, if you have a few extra shillings or farthings, please join the Friends of Franklin House. It is a wonderful endeavor. It is Benjamin Franklin's only surviving house. So I literally get teary-eyed every time I go in. It's the only place, as I keep saying, it's my version of a Jeffersonian's Monticello. It's a wonderful middling sort house, very near Trafalgar Square in London. And if you haven't been there, then you can, I guess they'll let us back in the UK in May. So you can start to book your flights now. Thank you all for being with us. It looks like there's a few dozen of us now. It's been a great joy to do this. As I say every time, the women of the Franklin House would call me remiss if I didn't say, I have a tradition of giving programs at Franklin House, and then we always can reconvene a few minutes later at the Ship and Shovel. So if you go out the front door of Franklin House, hang a left on Craven Street, walk to the next alley and hang another left. The Ship and Shovel is the only pub I know in the UK where the building is in two parts on either side of the alley. And as Marcia, the executive director, will attest, there is a Franklin Memorial bench in the pub. So I'll see you all for some cider in about 5 minutes, I hope. Peace be with thee on both sides of the Atlantic. See you next time.
Thank you.